In the shadowed corridors of Renaissance Italy, a time when holiness and corruption shared the same breath, a young girl's innocence was bartered away not for love or fate, but for power. Her name was Lucretzia Borgia, and 5 centuries later, it still echoes like a warning through the annals of history. She was born in 1480, in a Rome already unraveling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Art and enlightenment flourished in the streets, while the highest offices of the church were steeped in scandal. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, would one day wear the Triple Crown as Pope Alexander VI, perhaps the most morally bankrupt pontiff to ever occupy the throne of St. Peter. But long before his papal coronation, Rodrigo had already begun crafting a legacy of manipulation, with his illegitimate children, especially Lucrezia, the center of his designs. The Renaissance is often celebrated as an age of rebirth. Yet behind its polished facade lay a world where morality bent to the will of ambition and power was the only virtue. In the papal states, the sacred and the profane blended into one. And the Borgia family did more than participate in this decadence, they elevated it to an art form. Lucrezia was born to Rodrigo and his mistress, Vanessa de Catane. Her illegitimacy should have consigned her to the margins of society. Instead, it bound her tightly to her father's machinations. She wasn't hidden away, as was customary for many children born out of wedlock. On the contrary, she was cultivated. From childhood, molded to be a political instrumenta living treaty in human form in Lucrezia's Rome. Prayer and poison were equally common. Political rivalries ended not in debate, but in death. Even the Vatican had become a palace of intrigue where favors were traded for gold. Titles were auctioned off, and diplomacy often involved shadows and daggers. Within this world, Lucrezia was raised before she could even understand the rules of the game being played with her life. Eyewitnesses of the time chronicled events that today seem almost unthinkable. Papal ceremonies coexisted with events of unspeakable debauchery, all within the same palace walls. These weren't the exaggerations of enemies, but first-hand observations, like those recorded by Johann Burchard, a German official in the Vatican. The details he left behind remain a chilling testament to the world Lucrezia was born into. Her education wasn't rooted in faith or virtue. It was a masterclass in survival. By the time she was 11, Lucrezia had already been engaged twice. Betrothal, a move on her father's political chessboard. These arrangements had little to do with love. They were transactions. Her value was measured not in character or dreams, but in her ability to cement alliances. When Rodrigo Borgia became pope in 1492, Lucrezia was just 12. His ascent was achieved not by divine calling, but through vast bribes and promises exchanged. In the conclave, it was a victory of gold over gospel. With his new power, Rodrigo accelerated his ambitions. Then Lucrezia's life was swept up in the current dot. At 13, she was married off to Giovanni Sforza, a union arranged with surgical precision. The wedding, held within the Vatican, was a performance of power. Contemporary accounts described her as breathtaking, golden-haired, graceful, and far wiser than her age would suggest. But beauty in the Borgia family was a weapon, and Lucrezia was being trained to wield it. What followed after the wedding entered the realm of disturbing speculation. Whispers and accusations circulated allegations that observers at the time, given the family's reputation, found all too believable. Her privacy, her dignity, whatever boundaries should have protected a young girl, were instead violated in the name of political control. When the alliance with Giovanni Sforza no longer served its purpose, Pope Alexander sought to annul the marriage. In response, Giovanni made damning accusations, claims that the true reason for the annulment was not politics, but something darker lurking within the family. Whether those accusations were driven by anger or truth remains debated. What is clear is that the Vatican's handling of the matter plunged Lucrezia into public humiliation. Declaring the marriage unconsummated despite years of cohabitation, the Church demanded proof, and so, her body just a teenager's became a subject of official examination and whispered gossip throughout Rome. But perhaps the most haunting figure in Lucrezia's life was not her father, but her brother. Cesare Borgia, brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, was the sharp edge of the family's ambitions. Some believed his connection with Lucrezia crossed a line no sibling should approach. Whether true or born from the feverish minds of Rome's rumor mills, the suggestion itself reflected the grotesque reputation the Borgia dynasty had earned. Lucrezia Borgia's name has endured through centuries, not simply because of the crimes attributed to her, but because of what she represents: a pawn in a brutal game, sculpted by power-hungry men, and raised in an empire of sin disguised as sanctity. Whether victim, accomplice, or something in between, her story remains one of the Renaissance's darkest and most haunting legacies. Borgia's second marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, offered a fleeting glimpse of the life she might have lived under different circumstances. At just 17, she seemed to genuinely care for her new husband. Contemporary accounts suggest a brief period of peace and affection. The couple even welcomed a son, Rodrigo, small light in the darkness that surrounded the Borgia name. For a moment, it seemed possible that Lucrezia could escape the suffocating grip of corruption and manipulation that had defined her early years. But the Borgia family had made too many enemies, and true happiness was a luxury they could never afford. The affection Lucrezia showed Alfonso may have sealed his fate. Both her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Cesare appeared to view any emotional connection that didn't serve their ambitions as a threat. In one of the most brutal and tragic moments of her life, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica in 1500, though gravely injured. He survived the initial assault and was nursed back to health by Lucrezia herself, who prepared his meals and guarded against further attempts on his life, but not even she could protect him from her own family. Cesare reportedly saying that what was not done at lunch would be done at dinner. Stormed into Alfonso's sick room with his men, Lucrezia and her sister-in-law were forcibly removed. Moments later, Alfonso was strangled in his bed. The official cause of death was listed as fever, the psychological devastation of watching her brother murder her husband, while her father, the Pope, turned a blind eye, shattered whatever innocence remained in Lucrezia. Witnesses said she changed after that day. The once vibrant young woman became hollow-eyed, subdued, and distant. She had come to understand fully that she was not a daughter or a sister in any meaningful sense. She was property, a tool to be used. The tears she shed over Alfonso's body were among the last open displays of emotion the public would see from her for many years. Following Alfonso's murder, the whispers grew darker. Rumors about Lucrezia's relationship with both her father and brother swirled through the corridors of power. Servants whispered about midnight visits to the papal apartments. Jealous rage toward any man who approached his sister became legend. And then came the mystery of the child, known as Infans Romanus. The infant's parentage was cloaked in deliberate ambiguity. Some papal declarations hinted that Cesare was the father. Others pointed directly to the Pope himself. None dared to name the mother. By the time Lucrezia entered her third marriage, this time to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrarashi, was no longer the naive young woman thrust into political games. At 21, she was a survivor. The negotiations for this match revealed just how much she had learned. She bargained not just for a dowry, but for titles, positions, and security. If she was to be traded like a commodity, then she would ensure the terms were in her favor. Ferrara gave Lucrezia something she had never had before. With her father scheming in Rome and Cesare carving out a bloody dominion in central Italy, Lucrezia began to form a new identity. She became a patron of the arts, surrounding herself with poets, painters, and intellectuals. As an administrator, she surprised many with her skill governing Ferrara in her husband's absence with confidence and clarity. For the first time, removed from the immediate influence of her family, Lucrezia seemed to step into her own, but the past never truly disappeared. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, officially from fever, though suspicions of poison lingered, Lucrezia's reaction was telling. No weeping, no outward signs of grief, just a cold, measured response and an immediate shift toward protecting her political standing. The death of the man who had shaped her life, who had given her status but robbed her of autonomy, elicited no visible sorrow. Only calculation. It was perhaps the clearest sign of the damage done. A daughter receiving news of her father's death and feeling nothing but relief. Caesar's fall followed swiftly. Without papal protection, his enemies closed in. The man who had terrorized Italy, who had possibly murdered his own brother, and certainly orchestrated the killing of Lucrezia's husband, was captured, escaped, and eventually killed in a minor skirmish in Spain. Lucrezia's public response to her brother's death was muted, though some noted that she wore mourning attire far longer than protocol required. Whether this reflected genuine grief, political strategy, or unresolved trauma remains uncertain. The years in Ferrara would become Lucrezia's quiet triumph. She mastered multiple languages, exchanged letters with Europe's most brilliant minds, and created a court that rivaled any in Renaissance Italy. The poetry written for her spoke not of scandal, but of intellect, elegance, and refinement. Even Pietro Bembo, one of the most esteemed humanists of the time, carried on a deeply intellectual and emotionally charged correspondence with her, revealing a woman of complexity, wit, and resilience. And yet, even in Ferrara, she could not fully escape the cost of her past. Her pregnancies were many, and most ended in tragedy. Miscarriages, stillbirths, each one a reminder that her body had never fully belonged to her. Over the course of her life, she would endure at least 11 pregnancies. The toll of constant childbearing, coupled with the emotional wounds of her youth, shaped a woman who was both powerful and fragile, someone who had endured more than most could fathom. Lucretzia Borgia remains one of history's most misunderstood figures, not a simple villain nor a passive victim, but a survivor of extraordinary circumstances. In a world that tried to define her, she found a way, at last, to define herself. The children who survived became both Lucrezia's solace and her burden. In their eyes, she glimpsed the fragile hope of a different life, one unmarked by the infamous legacy of the Borgia name. By every contemporary account, she was a devoted mother, fiercely protective, determined to shield her children from the corruption that had defined her own childhood. And yet, how could she not watch them closely? How could she not wonder if the sins of the past would find their way into the next generation? If the same darkness that had haunted her would eventually re-emerge, despite her desperate efforts to stop it? Her letters from these years reveal a woman far removed from the poisonous caricature painted by her enemies. The Lucrezia that emerges from her own hand is intelligent, thoughtful, and deeply engaged with the intellectual currents of her time. She wrote about art, philosophy, governance, and poetry, but rarely, if ever, about her past. That silence speaks volumes. Some wounds lie too deep for words. Her relationship with Alfonso Destin-like, her previous politically orchestrated unions blossomed into something that resembled a real partnership. Freed, at last, from her family's constant interference, she was allowed to navigate this marriage on her own terms. Alfonso, at first wary of the infamous Lucretzia Borgia, came to respect her judgment and rely on her counsel. She bore him children, continuing the Dest line, but this time her role in dynastic succession came with a measure of dignity and agency. In 1519, her final pregnancy would prove fatal. At 39, exhausted by years of childbirth and the weight of a life marked by both privilege and trauma, Lucretzia gave birth to a daughter who survived only briefly. Days later, Lucretzia herself died of complications. Her passing was met with genuine grief in Ferrara, where she had long since shed the image of a scandalous daughter and had become a respected duchess and patron of the arts. Witnesses to her final hours described a woman facing death with unexpected calm. She settled her affairs with precision, made provisions for her children, and received the last rites in a far more spiritual setting than the corrupted church of her youth. In those final moments, she seemed to find a peace that had eluded her in life. The real Lucretzia Borgia bears little resemblance to the femme fatale of legend. Despite centuries of rumor, there is no credible evidence that she ever poisoned anyone. The notorious ring with a hidden compartment for poison, a product of myth. The image of a seductive killer was more convenient and more entertaining than the truth. Modern historians have worked to restore her reputation, portraying her not as a conspirator in her family's crimes, but as one of its victims. The most scandalous allegations about her relationships, her supposed moral failings, tell us more about her family's reputation and their enemies' propaganda than about Lucretzia herself. What is clear, however, is that from an early age, she endured deep emotional and psychological trauma, and perhaps worse, her tragedy lies not in the lurid tales that followed her through history, but in the reality of a gifted woman whose life was commandeered by the ambitions of others. Denied autonomy, used as a political pawn, and forced to bear witness to acts of cruelty by those closest to her, Lucretia survived a world that was never hers to shape, and yet she did shape it in small, significant ways. She governed, she created, she supported the arts. That she emerged not only as a survivor, but as a competent ruler, speaks to an inner strength rarely acknowledged in the shadow of her name. Her story exposes the darker side of the Renaissance, how power corrupted absolutely, how women were commodified, and how even the most sacred institutions could become tools of exploitation. The papal court, once imagined as a beacon of morality, had become a theater of moral collapse. In such a world, Lucretia's suffering was not an exception, but a symptom. Her legacy stretches beyond personal redemption. She stands as a symbol for countless women through history, those born into impossible circumstances, forced to navigate systems designed to silence them. Lucretia's transformation from pawn to player reveals that even within deep oppression, a sliver of agency can survive. In studying her life, we also confront how history itself is shaped. For centuries, sensationalized myths drowned out documented truth. The tale of a seductive poisoner sold more books than the sobering account of a traumatized child who became a dignified duchess. It's a reminder that misogyny and sensationalism often write history's first drafts, turning victims into villains and obscuring the real crimes of those in power. The true horror of Lucretzia Borgia's life is not in the accusations of poison or scandal. It's in the documented reality of a young woman robbed of choice, dignity, and peace, who nonetheless carved out a legacy that defied the cage she was born into, papacy, and earned infamy as perhaps the most corrupt pope in history. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by forces entirely beyond her control. Yet even within the suffocating grip of power, politics, and patriarchy, she found brief, flickering moments of dignity, intelligence, and even beauty. Borgia's life is often remembered for its scandal, but perhaps the greatest tragedy is how ordinary her fate truly was. Yes, the specifics, papal intrigue, family betrayal, murder whispered behind palace walls, were extraordinary. But the larger pattern was painfully familiar. A woman used as a pawn in games she didn't choose, denied agency, and blamed for the sins of men. Her story is often portrayed as unique, but it stands out only because it was recorded. Countless other women met similar ends, their names lost to time, their suffering buried beneath centuries of silence. The cruelest twist of all is that Lucrezia is remembered not for what she endured, but for what she never did. Her name became synonymous with poison, seduction, and betrayal. Meanwhile, the men who orchestrated real horrors, who manipulated, murdered, and corrupted the very institution of the church, often cast as ambitious, eccentric, or even charming. In this inversion of victim and villain, Lucretzia Borgia, even in death, the narrative wrapped around her is not her own. And in that way, her story continues to speak to our time: the manipulation of truth, the erasure of victims, the institutional forces that protect abusers while blaming the abused. These are not relics of the past, they echo into the present. Power still isolates, control still masquerades as care. Abuse is still rationalized and normalized. What might she have become if she had been born in a different time to a different family? Her intellect, her resilience, her ability to learn and adapt hint at a woman who could have been extraordinary on her own terms, but she was given no such luxury. Her brilliance had to be channeled into survival, and in surviving, she became extraordinary in a different way. That, perhaps, is her real legacy. Her life forces us to reconsider the Renaissance not as a gilded age of enlightenment, but as a time of stark contradiction. The same civilization that gave the world Da Vinci and Michelangelo also produced the darkest excesses of papal politics. Lucrezia stood at the fault line of that contradiction, a product of her era, yes, but also one of its most tragic victims. As we examine her story, we're left with questions that resist simple answers. How do we reckon with people who are both participants in and casualties of corrupt systems? How do we separate the historical figure from the myth, the person from the propaganda? Lucrezia Borgia's life doesn't offer tidy conclusions. There are no pure heroes, no clear villains, only the messy, painful reality of a woman caught in the machinery of power. More than 500 years after her death, her story still mirrors our own questions about gender, power, and survival. She was not the femme fatale of legend. She was something far more unsettling, a human being whose very humanity was denied from the moment she was born. She was trained to be complicit in her own oppression. And yet, despite that, she managed to create something resembling a life. She endured, she ruled, she loved in the few ways allowed to her. In this endurance, there is something redemptive, not in absolution for crimes she never committed, but in the strength it took to remain human within a system built to dehumanize. The bells that rang in 1519 to mark her passing told not just for the end of a life, but for the collapse of potential. She had been a daughter to a corrupt cardinal turned pope, a sister to a violent and unstable brother, a piece in countless political arrangements. And yet, she had also been a mother, a supporter of the arts, and a capable ruler in her own right. Her tragedy is not in what she became, but in what she was never allowed to become. History's final cruelty is its silence. We will never truly know who Lucrezia Borgia was beneath the roles imposed upon her. What did she dream of in the stillness? Between performances, what did she feel as she endured marriage after marriage, loss after loss? There are no answers, only the silence left by a voice that was never allowed to speak for itself. Perhaps the most chilling part of her story is how completely power can warp even the most intimate relationships. A father's love twisted into possession, a brother's loyalty into domination, marriage into currency, even motherhood reduced to obligation. Every sacred bond became contaminated by power's logic, leaving no space untouched by corruption. To survive this world, Lucrezia had to perform emotions. She wasn't allowed to genuinely feel. She had to interpret cruelty as affection. She had to mistake control for care. Today, she is not a symbol of feminine wickedness, but of feminine endurance. Her story tears away the illusions we might hold about the so-called glory of the past. It reminds us that civilization and barbarity can, and often do, exist side by side. That institutions built to protect can just as easily become tools of harm, and that behind every sensationalized scandal lies a human being wounded, silenced, and often forgotten. Treat the powerless, how we use power, and how we choose to remember those who were never allowed to speak for themselves. She was raised for corruption, groomed for exploitation, and forced into complicity with her own suffering. That she retained any semblance of humanity at all is nothing short of remarkable. That history remembered her as the villain instead of the victim is an injustice that remains unresolved to this day. In death, as in life, Lucrezia Borgia remains a prisoner of other people's narratives. Her true self, like the Renaissance's promise of human dignity, always just out of reach.